Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. This week's Full Scottish. My name is Kim Marshall. Located as we are in our Stirling Studio, which looks out onto the National Wallace Monument, we remember that on this day in 1305, William Wallace was murdered by the King of England, Edward I, for refusing to accept English rule over Scotland. On the programme this week, we are delighted to be joined by Paul McLennan, MSP. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon, Kim.
And Hugh Marshall, no relation, from Talking Wales. Good afternoon, Hugh.
Hi, Kim. Nice to meet a fellow Marshall.
So, to start, we will begin with our Middle East update. 1,285 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since the start of the October 2025 ceasefire, bringing the total number of Palestinians killed in Gaza since October 7th, 2023 to 73,419. Israel has pursued its resettlement of Qadim in the West Bank 20 years after the settlers were evacuated, despite this being illegal under international law. This will also impact any chance of a Palestinian state and two-state solution. Now, it's been suggested that Netanyahu is pushing forward on this in time for the upcoming elections in Israel. So, why the continuing lack of action from the international community? And why do either of you think that there's been no notable change in the stance of the UK government towards Israel's actions? We go to Paul first.
I'm hopeful we'll start to see some noises being made by the UK government. I think I know Ed Miliband is pushing at that particular point, and I think they're discussing around about obviously trade sanctions as well. I think the situation has gone on far too long. The UK government has sat on its hands for a long enough period of time, and this is a long-term tactic by the Israeli government to make sure that settlements disrupt any possible discussions going forward about a two-state solution. That's a very strategic move that Israel has been engaging in for a long number of years. But hopefully, Ed Miliband may get his way in UK government, and we'll start to see efficient, effective trade sanctions, rather than just the formal position that was taken up by Starmer previously. So we'll wait and see. But it's a very strategic decision that's been made by the Israelis over a long number of years.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Hugh?
Yeah, I agree with what Paul was saying. I think it's good to hear Miliband using language that was far stronger than under the previous Prime Minister in Keir Starmer. And I think Burnham understands that, a lot of people in, the British public, Welsh and Scottish and Northern Irish, do feel passionately about the way Palestinians are being treated. The number of Palestinians murdered again this week, including children. It just continues. It is difficult while you've got Trump in the White House, who is incredibly ineffective. He's full of bluster. He says, he's going to do deals, but when you actually look at what he actually achieves, it's very little. So hopefully Miliband and the Westminster government will take a stronger stand. I know other European countries have.
Okay, thanks. I mean, and just moving on from that point, that Trump's war in the Middle East has this week gone past the 6-month mark with no sign of resolution, and this is a war with no congressional approval, which appears to be depleting US military reserves at a rate unmatched by any previous action. Now, we know that Congress has passed a very ineffective resolution to ask Trump to withdraw, but this appears to be ineffective. I know you touched on this, Hugh, but Paul, do you have any further thoughts as to, is there any end to this?
No, I don't think you can see it at the moment. The typical Trump, he's gone into the and he calls it a conflict, of course, not a war. He's gone into the conflict with no end game, and that seems to be his tactics. And a lot of things he does, he shoots from the hip, and he's no tactics to get out of it. Obviously, we have the mid-term elections coming up in November, which will obviously be very topical on his mind at the moment. And I think when you see the price of gasoline in the US, which seems to be a big issue for voters, then that may force him into doing something rather than anything else in terms of this. But we see no way out. And as I said, Trump is shot from the hip. He has no tactics, no strategy to get out of this conflict at all. And it seems just to be standing still. And as you said, Kim, the amount of money that he's spending and going through is unbelievable, is record breaking in terms of that, and it's just going to push up the already very high deficit that the US has. And I think he'll get his retribution in November in the midterms, but we'll wait and see.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Hugh, do you have anything further to comment on there?
Yeah, exactly what Paul was saying. I think it was interesting this week that there was mention of the bond markets being spooked, and we know in the UK, there is an obsession around that. But actually, it was the bond market in the US as well. As Paul mentioned, I think one of the big problems with Trump is the fact that at least during his first period, he was surrounded by people who sort of knew what he was doing. This time, he hasn't got that. He's got people like Hegseth. He's using people like Jared Kushner as his spokesperson. So he hasn't got the diplomatic tools that that were once there, and frankly it shows. So yeah, it is worrying.
Okay. This actually segues us fairly neatly into talking about Ukraine and the fact that there is an absence of US military hardware to be supplied to Ukraine, and this week French President Emmanuel Macron has promised to strengthen support for Ukraine with the delivery of European interceptor missiles after a call with President Volodymyr Zelensky, in which they discussed the shortage of air defense to Kiev. And this move comes during a surge in Russian strikes that have pushed civilian deaths to the highest since the first month of the Moscow invasion. Macron said that they would continue to work with the anti-missile coalition, which was launched at a meeting in Paris in July, and the coalition consists of 10 European countries which are developing an anti-ballistic missile system as a cheaper alternative to the US Patriots. Unfortunately, the Patriot air defense system is the only weapon in Ukraine's arsenal which is capable of downing the high-speed ballistic missiles used by Russia in its war in Ukraine. And on Saturday, Vladimir Putin said that Ukraine's attacks on Russian economic targets had opened a Pandora's box of Russian retaliation. Ukraine says its strikes are intended to choke off the financing for Moscow's war efforts. Ukraine's allies in the coalition of the willing will meet on Monday to look at how to ramp up pressure on Moscow to halt its invasion. Russia's fired a ballistic missile in the middle of the day towards Kyiv, while the German Foreign Minister Johann Vadeful was visiting on Saturday for talks with Zelensky. Two people were killed and several wounded in the Boryspil district on the eastern outskirts of the city. Odessa Governor Oleg Kipa said 3 people had been wounded, including a 16-year-old girl, in a prolonged and combined strike that hit a house and grain silos, and at least 4 further people were killed in a series of strikes in the frontline region of Zaporizhia, Ukrainian officials said. Ukrainian drones have hit targets across Russia and the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, including warehouses owned by an online retailer, Ozon, and an industrial facility. The attack is the first on Ozon, which is Russia's second-largest online retailer, following weeks of drone strikes on its larger rival, Wildberries, which Ukraine has cast as part of a wider campaign against the economic infrastructure underpinning the Russian war in Ukraine. Is there any end to this? Hugh?
It was quite interesting this morning because obviously there was talk this week of UK manufactured drones being used in attacks on Russia, and as a result, I believe this morning the Russian ambassador has been withdrawn from London, with no replacement being sort of put forward. So it does look as though that there is some sort of impact there. I think it's clear that one of the things that wasn't foreseen was how Ukraine would actually develop its own sort of military capabilities, especially around drones and that kind of technology. They are now world leaders in that sector. But yeah, you in the week where you had Trump praising North Korea, who were supplying Russia with weapons and military personnel, you just see how difficult the situation is when you've got Trump, who can't see the difference between right and wrong, and actually, when it comes down to it, he likes, the dictators who he seems to model himself on.
Mm-hmm. Paul, do you have any further comment?
I think we're seeing kind of almost like a multi-pronged war, if you like, in here. I think the actual war itself is going on, and obviously between Ukraine and Russia, and I think this is a lot around about Putin saving face. More broadly, I think this is Putin's, I suppose, wider engagement with the West and trying to almost threaten the West in terms of this. And is it a precursor for him trying maybe to go into other countries, former Soviet countries? I don't know. There's obviously a bit of debate going on around about that as well. And I think, like you, the defensive, I think there's two parts of this war as well. There's the defensive part of it, which I think obviously how does the Ukraine defend itself? And I think there's the offensive part of it as well. And we're kind of almost seeing, probably in this war more than any other war, the input of obviously drones into that, and how do the Ukraine, and again I think that's given some advantage to the Ukraine, because obviously it struck well into Russian targets that it would never have done with either missiles or anything else in terms of that. I think it's hard to see where this war is going to be won either way. There will have to be, like many other wars, a negotiated peace, and I think what we're seeing just now is who can get the best deal out of that. But nobody's making progress on the ground. There is nobody making any progress at all. This is all around about trying to keep a hold of what they have, and there will have to be a negotiated into this. Russia can't keep on doing what it's doing. It will also have a shortage of offensive weapons in terms of that. In Ukraine, obviously has an issue. It needs to continue to engage with the West in terms of its defensive capabilities as well. So it's an ongoing war, which I can't see at any stage. And you talked around about obviously the influence of Trump. This was a supposed war that Trump had said he would stop on day one. He's not done anything about it whatsoever. In fact, him not standing up to Trump on this is prolonging the war considerably.
Thank you. And hopefully the last time that we are mentioning Trump this morning. But it really was Taco Tuesday this week, as Trump yet again temporarily paused tariffs on, this time, Canadian goods. However, yesterday, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that the trade talks between the US and Canada had broken down after Trump tried to block Canada from doing trade deals with other countries. Carney said that last-minute changes in the US proposed terms were unfair, uneconomic, and called into question the reliability of any deal. Both sides will now impose tariffs, but I think the question that needs to be discussed is, how is this actually going to impact on both of their economies, given that Canada is the US's largest trade partner? And what impact will this also have on the global economy? Paul?
I think it's been proven over a long period of time. Tariffs don't work. They don't work. I mean, you'll hear Trump saying this it will help the US. It doesn't help the US. It'll be detrimental to US trading businesses, as it will be to Canada. Canada has no option if the US come in first with the tariffs. But nobody wins from this whatsoever. And again, it comes back to Trump's haphazard way about how he tries to negotiate. And obviously there's been questions around about the legality of his tariffs. That's been challenged in the courts, and obviously that challenge was won. So Trump is coming back in with tariffs, but nobody wins from this. Nobody wins from this, and this is supposedly under his America First kind of mantra, but that's not working. Businesses in both Canada and the US will suffer because of this, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Hugh, can I just see if you've got any thoughts about Trump's reaction to this, just returning to his constant rhetoric about, well, actually, Canada really wants to be the 51st state?
Yeah, it's just the same old Trump now, isn't it? He just comes out with the same lines over and over again. People are questioning his cognitive abilities. There's been mention of Caroline Harp, I believe, the assistant who flew out in the decoy aircraft. And yeah, I think it's clear he's just losing his grip, isn't he? I think it's clear that he seems to be deteriorating week on week. We see clips of him falling asleep all the time. There was pictures of him from behind where he had something very, very strange going on down the back of his trousers. It's all a bit weird, isn't it? And unfortunately, it's a bit depressing because what Trump does and what US does have an impact on global economy. Just look at how we're still paying. I filled up the car yesterday. I was paying £1.60 a litre. Before Trump's Iranian madness, I think it was about £1.29. So, but that's something now we're just accepting as just the norm. But that is because of Trump. And again, we have to remember that a lot of these Trump policies, these idiotic sort of populist stuff, is the stuff that Farage wants to bring over here as well. So so there's a warning, not just from an economic point of view, but from a political point of view, how it can impact us in Wales and Scotland as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, I think actually the human being is actually, her name is Natalie. And this certainly seems to be a very good situation for use of the 25th Amendment. This is exactly what it's designed for. But nobody seems to have the cojones to go ahead with it. But anyway, let's move now to our own economy and how things are going under our new Prime Minister and his buses. Well, inflation has actually risen now to 2.9% in the UK this week, with predictions of further increases in the cost of energy, food and fuel. Borrowing costs have also been higher this month than last, and Mr. Burnham has promised to do something about the cost of living. So, gentlemen, is this the end of the Burnham bounce? And what does the government have to do in the budget to turn things around? Paul?
I think it's very. I think there was always going to be some kind of bounce as a recovery from Keir Starmer. I think he was the most unpopular Prime Minister, so I think the Burnham bounce has been more that he's not Keir Starmer rather than Andy Burnham himself. And I think obviously we've seen Reform struggling a little bit in the polls as well. I think if you look at the broader issues, inflation has increased. It will continue to go higher. The Iranian war obviously is kept on top of that. Energy prices are still high, and I think the forecast is it will still be higher as we go into 2027. I think when you look at borrowing, UK government borrowing is also at a record high, and I think that's beginning, as you said, beginning to spook the bond markets in the UK because they are continuing to see that continuing to go. We've got a UK deficit and national debt of around about £3 trillion already. So, and every 10 pence in the pound that the UK has is paid back to borrowing. So, and obviously then he's looking at the budget deficit. He's going to have to do that, and he's promised numerous things since he's came into power, but not how he's going to pay for that. We've got other pressing issues such as defence spending that's there in terms of that as well. So it's going to be a very tough budget, I think, for them in terms of, and I think, if he's going to be brave enough, he will have to go down the route and see what he can do in terms of looking at increasing taxes. I think if he's looking to cut other budgets, then it's going to be very unpopular. So it's going to be a tough budget for him, and I think it will come. I think you will start to see political reality come back into polling in the next few months, certainly before Christmas, I would imagine.
Hugh?
Yeah, just on a happier note, both myself and Andy Burnham were both Everton fans, and Andy was at the Hill Dixon Stadium yesterday, and Everton actually won the opening game for the first time in 5 years. But yeah, no, I think I think the challenge that Burnham is facing at the moment is the fact that Parliament is in recess. So there's less news, actual news, sort of doing the rounds, and he's giving him less opportunity to talk about things. I think, as Paul mentioned, it is going to be a tough budget. But again, I think he realises, and the people around him realise, compared with Starmer, is that you need to be bold and braver, and more aggressive when it comes to the economy. Because what Rachel Reeves was doing, it was literally just carrying on with what was happening before under the Conservatives, and that was a huge part of their unpopularity. I think Burnham is clearly far better communicator. He comes across as a normal person that people can relate to. But I think the challenges facing Labour, although Starmer was a big problem, I think that the challenges go even deeper.
You just mentioned being bolder and braver. Could you give us an example of a policy which Burnham could take on, which would fit within his sort of policy platform that would be bolder and braver?
Yeah, well, I just think sort of investing in infrastructure. One of the things that Blair did that was positive was obviously sort of investing in hospitals and schools. Sadly, they used PFI, and we're still paying the price of that now. But at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with borrowing money to invest in an infrastructure that's going to create jobs, that's going to improve the economy across the UK. And again, things like, you read that Amazon, paid, a couple of £1,000 in tax last year. It's crazy. They have to come up with, new ways of being able to tax not just the super rich, but the companies who are operating here that are making huge profits off the back of British citizens, and yet they're not contributing to the economy in a way that they should be. So, I think there are bold moves that he can take, but I think that it is this fear of, we can't borrow, we can't do this. Of course you can, you know what I mean? It's, under the economy, he can print his own money if he wants to. But, I think, from an economic point of view, they need to take a different approach, because you're not going to get growth based on, on the current sort of economic plans. And you can't just, capitalism just doesn't work. You need to think of a new economic plan. And that's where, bravery and boldness comes in.
All right, I just want to bring Paul in on this one, because one of the things that could have been really brave and bold was to actually let Scotland have the factory to produce wind farms, machinery, the Chinese factory, but that was blocked by the UK government, and Burnham doesn't seem to be turning on that one. I mean, do you think there are things which Burnham could, if he wanted to, actually learn from what's been done in Scotland for what could be done in Wales? I mean, particularly with our renewables industry. That could be really bold and really brave, but we can't do it.
I think there is coming. The Ming Yang investment was £1.5 billion, which made a huge difference in terms of that. And they've said it's national security, but without going into huge detail to the Scottish government about that. I think there's a number of things that Andy Burnham could help Scotland with. I think one is in terms of it's given Scotland the same fiscal freedom that the UK government has. And when I was House Minister, I didn't have the ability to borrow money to go build houses. And so that, which is a crazy situation because you've got a return on that. So I think, that would have promoted economic development. I know in discussions I had with the then Labour government in Wales and the Northern Ireland executive, they wanted these same powers. So that's something they could do very, very quickly. We've seen the influence of giving the ability for Northern Ireland and about corporation tax and giving that to Scotland and Wales in terms of that as well. So if he's talking about, devolution, as he says he's looking to do, will devolve these powers to Scotland and Wales now. That could tell economic development in terms of this and give us the ability to borrow, to invest in our own economies. If he's not willing to do it in the UK, then give Scotland and Wales the ability to go do that. Renewable sector is a huge sector in Scotland. It has contributed jobs, but even then, when it comes back to some of the issues around about pricing, in terms of that as well, in transmission, then these are still reserved to the UK government. And again, this is holding back the growth of the sector in Wales. So there are many things Andy Burnham could do now to increase economic prosperity in Scotland and in Wales. In terms of broader, he should be looking to invest borrowing to invest in infrastructure. That is the way that we need to do that. The infrastructure development is very important and can be a real contributor to economic growth. But he can give Scotland and Wales more powers now if he wanted to.
Okay. I'm going to ask another question. I think Paul might want to jump in on this one first, but Rosebank. Burnham has basically just kicked that into the long grass again. If it was within your purview to advise Mr. Burnham what to do over Rosebank, what sort of suggestions would you put to him?
In terms of that and Rosebank and Jackdaw, I think there's two ways to look at this. I think one is you weigh up the economic argument in terms of what's economic prosperity and the jobs that it could bring over a short period of time. The second thing is what is the impact it's going to have on climate change in terms of this going forward. The Scottish Government doesn't have the power to make its decision on this, and I think the First Minister's talked around about there needs to be that balance and that climate compatibility. My big concern is when you look at the climate and you see what's happening to the climate just in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly this summer, and what we're kind of seeing being forecast through El Nino and what could happen even next year with even warmer temperatures, we need to be challenging that. I don't think the expansion of Jackdaw and Rosebank, and this is my own personal opinion, it will help that in any way, shape or form. So I hope you see sense in terms of that. And I think that's something that we don't need at this stage. Climate change is happening now. It's having an impact on us now and will cost us a lot more than economic benefits that will come through short term if that's granted. But that's my own personal opinion. Government will probably come to an opinion when it has to look at that in a little bit more detail.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Hugh, what would you advise Mr. Burnham?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what Paul says. I think there's this misunderstanding that that by somehow getting more oil and gas out of the North Sea is going to benefit people, in the UK and paying their bills. These are owned by private companies. The money is extracted. Okay, there are revenues that go to Westminster through taxes and excise, but on the whole, we don't benefit from that. I think the big issue is, in the UK, is this over-reliance on gas in particular. And we need to sort of get around that. You were talking about the Chinese investment, in Scotland in the wind turbines. We need that investment, and it needs to be ramped up. So again, sort of drilling from oil and gas, it's not going to make any difference at all to people's bills. And we've seen, apparently, it's nice to see the sun out on a normal day in August today, but apparently, we're going to be heading into another period of extreme hot weather in September. So it's clear that we need to tackle these issues. New oil and gas, we need to transition away. There is enough oil and gas at the moment. We just need to transition away from it. So sooner we do that, the better. But again, I can see that from a political point of view, it's an emotive thing. Jobs in Aberdeen, and areas like that. But what we need to see is jobs in other areas in renewables and something. And just quickly on the point of what Paul was saying about devolution, remember the Crown Estate isn't devolved in Wales, it is in Scotland. So any revenues that come from wind farms or whatever's going on in Wales, we don't see a penny of that.
Yeah, massively unfair. I mean, that's not something that we're actually going to go into in great detail, but certainly I think there are questions that could be raised about Mr. Burnham's definition of devolution, and one of the things that I would say was, can you just start by levelling up Wales? At least give Wales similar powers to what Scotland's got, and then actually have a look at what powers are devolved to the governments of Scotland and Wales, and see if there are things that they can do better, because definitely there are things that we do differently. Which brings us very neatly on to thinking about the success of small European countries. And there's been a very interesting piece of research that's come out by the Prosperity Index, which has found that small European nations, which include Ireland, Denmark, Finland, Norway, come top in a number of key indexes, including the standard of living, education, and health. And so, why not Scotland, Paul, or indeed Wales, Hugh? I'll let you fight over who's going to go first.
Go on, Paul. You go first.
I think this is an argument that Scotland, both the Scottish government and now hopefully the Welsh government will be saying the same in Plaid Cymru. You just have to look at the experience of these countries, and you're right. I mean, Ireland, Luxembourg, Norway, Switzerland, Denmark, Malta are all countries that are very small and similar in size to Scotland and Wales. And I think there's best in the size of it, its ability to try and in a much more nimble way. I think the key things and the big difference is we have powers, and we've talked about this as well. They have powers over corporation tax. They have powers about attracting business to come in this. They have all the financial levers, for example, over additional borrowing and so on as well, that Scotland and Wales don't have. And, we just have to point out to these countries to say they are the most successful. And when you look at the index, you see the countries that are down towards the bottom are France, obviously, then there's UK, then there's Italy, and then there's Spain. They're larger countries that don't have the flexibility and the nimbleness that we do. But the countries that are similar to ourselves have to. I talked about corporation tax, I talked about borrowing powers, we talked about the full financial levers that other countries have. We don't have that. And, there's that whole debate goes on around about budget deficits and fiscal deficits in Scotland and in Wales. The fiscal deficits and budget deficits are because of our link to the UK government and as part of that just now. So there is no reason whatsoever we can't be similar to these countries. And so hopefully we'll continue to point that out, and people will continue to see that, because index after index after index comes out saying the same things in terms of that. So and we will continue to push that until we get full independence, both in Scotland and in Wales.
Mm-hmm. You.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, how these comparisons are made on a regular basis, but obviously apparently it's not relevant to Scotland or Wales. How many countries that have sought independence have asked to go back to be part of the of the previous regime and organisation. I think the bigger issue, as Paul has pointed out, is just the lack of powers that the Scottish government and in particular the Welsh government, because we have fewer sort of fiscal levers compared to Scotland, and it does harm devolution, because people think, well, what's the point of devolution at the moment? It is hard because the powers that are available basically in Wales, when administrating Wales, the health service and education service on behalf of Westminster, but being allowed to do things, a little bit differently in those areas. So we need to have those levers. But I think this, for me, touches on a much broader point. Is it shows the lack of media in Wales and Scotland that are discussing these subjects in an objective manner, because people just aren't informed. Paul was talking about, when you talk about fiscal deficits, you always get people talking about, the household budgets and stuff like that. Running a country isn't like running a household, but they always use these comparisons. The situation about an independent country and what they're able to do from a borrowing point of view, and that's why these countries are able to prosper. Okay, Ireland, there are questions around the fact that they've attracted large businesses by giving them attractive corporation tax rates, but I think Ireland are transitioning from that. But yeah, I think people just need to be informed more. People need to be able to understand why Scotland and Wales can't do things that they want to do currently because they don't have the levers to do it.
Right, well, we are going to move on in a few minutes to talk about the media, particularly in Scotland. But one of the things that I want to go back to you, Hugh, on is part, I think, of why this is much further up the agenda in Scotland is because we're into our fifth SNP government. The sort of record that Westminster parties would absolutely kill for, sell their grannies for, at a profit. And only now does it seem to be that there is some real imagination in how to actually take the powers that Scotland has forward and use them for the benefit of Scotland, whereas under Labour administrations, we had First Minister saying, I've got £1 billion left over, what do I do with it? So the very lengthy preamble to the question is this, is that with the election now of a Plaid Cymru government in Wales, do you think this is going to change, or do you think we've actually going to have a period of settling in and testing the waters, or do you think Ruan ap Orath is going to go for it? Lots of questions in there.
Yeah, well, he is going forward, because Plaid Cymru came in, with a 100-day plan, and I think the 100 days was up this week. And the fact that they put out a plan means they've got things that they can be measured on and challenged on. Obviously, a lot of the first 100 days has been around appraising situations and launching sort of inquiries into things. But for example, they're looking into high streets. How can we improve high streets? They've launched a thorough sort of in-depth inquiry into food production in Wales, which is being chaired by Simon Wright, a well-known restaurateur in Wales. So so they are doing things, and they're doing things that they know they can do within their powers. I think it is interesting. Obviously, people forget, sort of Labour prior to May had been in power, since 1999. And were just given a free pass by everyone, by the media, by the public, and they just carried on, and they just thought it was going to carry on forever. So so that shock to the system has come through. Obviously, there's a challenge in the Senedd that you've got a large contingency of Reform Senedd members who don't offer much. Some of them, in fairness, have considered in a couple of areas where they have, but the rest of them are they're a complete waste of time, which is unfortunate, because what we need now is that level of scrutiny and that discussion so people can understand what's going on. But yeah, definitely, I think Rhyd ap Iorwerth is going for it, and I think the response so far to the Plaid Cymru government has been positive on the whole.
Paul, do you have anything further to add?
Yeah.
Do you think we might benefit in Scotland from a change to our electoral system? Because obviously that made a big difference to the result in the Senedd, having this broader list system for everything.
I think despite a system, Kim, that was set up to stop the SNP being in government 4 or 5 times, then that's obviously not worked. And I think the key thing is electoral success. Well, I think will continue in terms of this. There are a few key questions, I think, for me. One is in terms of the combined powers of both Scotland and Wales, and obviously Northern Ireland, and the Celtic Alliance, which we know was discussed yesterday, Kim, and the power of the 3 First Ministers in terms of that. I think there's been informal discussions. I know that will move on to a formal basis. And coming back to the Economic Prosperity Index, I think one of the key things is there are strong economic reasons for giving Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland more powers to deal with that. Strong economic reasons. The only reason that's not happening just now is purely political reasons by the UK government, both in terms of Tories and Labour just now, because they know that will make Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland more successful. And it's only political reasons that they're not giving Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland more powers to do that. But I think with the combined efforts of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, I think we continue to put that pressure on UK government to give us the devolution powers that Andy Burnham has talked about, short of obviously hopefully getting independence for all three countries and the United Ireland eventually as well too.
Right, well, I'm sure there will be much more to be said about this, and I think we can pick up now on something which has turned up in our conversation about the media. And certainly we've seen in recent weeks the BBC really, really ramping up its Scotland bad stories. Certainly, if you watch the main BBC Scotland news, you will see an absolutely relentless diet of stories about murder, serious organised crime, and child abuse. It is something which will convince you that Scotland is an absolute hellhole, and certainly this week's Disclosures programme plumbed new depths for the BBC. We were given a story about Glasgow in which they used sources which were right-wing racist vigilante groups, and certainly I think we can be reasonably asking questions about the BBC's motives and the BBC's integrity. And we know that this simply isn't true. This has been a complete media assassination of the city of Glasgow over the past week. We've had a phenomenal Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, which basically weren't covered. We saw an extraordinary demonstration of soft power in the US during the World Cup, courtesy of the Tartan Army, who were absolutely beloved on social media, but mainly dismissed by the BBC. And this is at a time when the BBC is running a campaign, sorry, I've just rephrased what I was going to say there, asking, what has the BBC done for you? So, Paul, Hugh, what has the BBC done for you?
Kim, I think there's a few important things to mention as well. Now, I'll come on to the show in Glasgow. The BBC doesn't spend all the money it's raised in Scotland, first of all, only spends about 60% of that. So we need to see the monies that are raised in Scotland spent in Scotland, and that includes programme production and so on. I think that's one key point in terms of this. I was on another radio show this morning talking about this very issue, and you're right, there was a vigilante group that are very closely linked to the far right that were taken as part of evidence in this programme. Now, that programme could have been balanced if they'd spoken to the Scottish Refugee Council, because there was an implication that asylum seekers were part of the problem. There was no pushback in that whatsoever. And I think the programme in the BBC has to be balanced. I don't think the programme was balanced in any way, shape or form. And of course, there have been certain issues in the various parts in Glasgow, but there was no balance, as you said, Kim, in terms of the fantastic Commonwealth Games that we had, around about the I suppose the ongoing prosperity in terms of retail in Glasgow, in terms of this. The council and the police are working very closely with others in terms of trying to address some of these issues that are there, but there was no balance. And of course, media is there to try and hold people to scrutiny, but it has to be balanced, and especially the BBC and some of the issues it's faced in the last number of years. This wasn't a balanced programme, and I think this is just part of an ongoing. I suppose when you've seen it over the last number of years, in terms of the production, it's just been downgraded. It's a long-term commitment to have a go at Scotland, and it's not fair balance. And said they don't even spend the money they raise in Scotland first and foremost. And I think there are real issues around about that. I know there's been a lot of publicity around about the programme up here, and I don't think it's helped the overall narrative about this whatsoever. So the BBC have got a lot to answer on this particular point.
Hugh?
I think it's quite interesting, the programme you're talking about has actually, I've seen quite a bit about that this week. So it's obviously sort of going beyond the borders of Scotland, discussion of the programme, because it was quite telling that, when the BBC did a documentary and then it was revealed that the child who was the sort of narrator of the documentary was the son of a Hamas political official, the whole world sort of caved in, and yet something like this happens, and it's almost as if it's like, oh, it's only Scotland, we brush it under the carpet. I think it's interesting to think when you go back almost a decade now, when they were looking at the nations of Wales and Scotland, that they were going to invest into those countries. In Scotland, they invested in news, so the Seven TV programme, they published, employed more journalists in order to apparently, sort of provide people in Scotland with better news. It's the fact that there was an SNP government that probably forced the BBC to actually, to do that, to have that. But the fact that it does appear to be, sort of SNP bad, 1 week or week out, because all we hear in the UK about is things like Calmac, the ferries and how, disastrous, those things are. When you look at things like education results and, the health outcomes and child poverty in Scotland compared with England and Wales, you see that Scotland is, under an SNP government, is doing far, far better. Yet we don't, that isn't a story that is told. So when Scotland were given, extra news, extra journalists, Wales apparently, what Wales wanted was, but even though there was no discussion with the people of Wales, was better representation on the national stage. So more Welsh voices in BBC drama, which is patronising to say the least. But I think it goes back to the issue that the BBC is the dominant media. Ofcom did a report showing that the BBC is still the dominant force when it comes to people for where they get their news from. We've got the discussion now around the BBC's future funding, and it's something that needs to be discussed. Because we pay for the BBC. People forget that. It's not funded out of taxpayers' money. It's funded from a license fee that we have to pay in order to get those services, and yet we don't seem to have a say in what those services should be. So, I think there's a lot that needs sorting out with the BBC. I think Andy Burnham, he's got a tough job there, because obviously, we know the amount of people who were involved in BBC News and current affairs who have backgrounds with, certain political parties and political affiliations. And it is something that needs to be sorted. The BBC should be impartial and be able to give people the information they need. But, I think the trust in the BBC is going down, and, just trust in news in general because of that is at one of its lowest points. And that's, based on Ofcom research.
Thanks, Hugh. Just want to take it a bit wider, because one of the things that we saw this week was on the BBC, shots of an empty podium, waiting for Reform to turn up to give us their latest policy ideas. Now, we'd never get that sort of coverage in Scotland. I mean, we have to scrap for First Minister to actually get fair and balanced coverage, rather than, oh, look, John Swinney took first-class flights to go to the US. Yeah, well, what about Andy Burnham using private jets to get around the UK? It's a wider problem which seems to be particularly obvious in Scotland. And just on the point that at the moment, the new Batman film is being filmed in Scotland. And yes, you could possibly say that Gotham City does have lots of police wandering around. It's very dark, but that's not Glasgow. And the fact that we've got a second major film coming to Glasgow on the heels of the Spider-Man film, which has just come to cinemas, is a real vote of confidence in Glasgow and Glasgow's economy and the local people who can come and do the jobs to support these productions. And this sort of reporting, this relentless negativity, is actually harmful to our economy. I mean, you touched on ferries. We know that's this sort of ferries not running. Actually, they're some of the most reliable in the world, but we never hear that. So, what I was going to put the point to you about was, is there any way to counter this? I mean, I know the three of us are sitting here this morning giving a Scottish view on Scottish things. and a Celtic view on Scottish things. But how can we possibly overcome this inbuilt media bias? Is there anything that we can do? Do you have any ideas, gentlemen?
I think there are a number of things. One, I think obviously the BBC has got a consultation out at the moment about its future, and I think we should encourage all people to feed into that, and certainly from a political element as well, in terms of that, to get that political balance. The most basic thing, and I think this is something that both Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish governments can talk about, is and we're talking about powers. It is devolving broadcasting to Scotland and to Wales, not having it as a reserve matter. And it's a reserve matter for a reason, because they control what goes on with about it. So we should be devolving broadcasting, not just for the likes of the BBC, but for other reasons as well, to make sure that all our communities that are served by the BBC, because they're cutting their services all over the place. And we've seen STV, for example, cut its STV North news, and we have no power to deal with that whatsoever. So they should be very quickly, and this is what Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish governments should be asking about, is devolving broadcasting to the countries, to devolve countries as soon as possible, and let them develop an impartial BBC service that serves all parts of our country. So that would be my ask of the First Ministers in Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland.
And Hugh, what would be your ask?
Yeah. Definitely. Well, it's quite interesting. The DCMS have been doing some research into local news provision, because we've seen lots of local titles disappear over the years, and that lack of news means that people live in communities don't understand what's going on in their communities. The DCMS then decided that they were going to create a £12 million fund. And it's based around innovation, which for me is they're looking at it from the wrong direction. But what was interesting was the fund was available to organisations in England and Wales. As Paul mentioned, broadcasting and information isn't devolved to Wales and Scotland. Plaid Cymru have come out saying, one of the reasons saying, well, this is why we need to devolve broadcasting and communications, is that the Plaid Cymru government didn't know anything about this fund, including Wales, because there was no sort of Barnet, from a Barnet consequential. If there was, then Scotland would have had it as well. And I know that Rhiannon at Greater Govanhill has, raised the issue that Scotland was included in this, and and it has had a lot of attention within, the news sort of landscape in the UK. But I think what we need to remember as well is broadcasting and communication. And I think broadcasting, it's the language. I wrote a Substack about this a couple of weeks ago. It's the language we use. Broadcasting is almost like an irrelevant term these days, because people, access content, online whenever they want. A lot of people, young people get their news from TikTok, Instagram. So, it's a whole new ecosystem that we need to look at. Because the BBC, as it is now, it's becoming an irrelevance as a live TV channel, because people just don't watch live TV anymore. Yeah, they watch sport, and they'll watch things like The Apprentice or Traitors, but in general, the landscape of how people get content, but also it's the information bit that's important, because we should be looking at news and information as something just as important as transport and health. It's something that needs to be invested in order for people to have, to be able to take educated decisions when they come to vote, for example.
Thank you, Hugh. And our final item today, with our outside broadcast van off the road, our visits to the Edinburgh Festival have sadly been curtailed. However, we're going to end today's programme with an interview with Eamon Gearan about his show, Lawrence of Arabia and Me. Have you visited the festival at all, guys? Have you seen any of these shows?
I've been up once already. I am literally heading up to Edinburgh after this to go see a show this afternoon. So Edinburgh and the festival is a fantastic time, and I actually had the pleasure of speaking to the director for the festivals just at an event with Edinburgh University last week. And one of the key stats that she mentioned in terms of me, the number of people that get during the festival is equivalent to having the Olympic Games every single year.
Wow.
In terms of that. It is a great financial contributor to Edinburgh, to Scotland. Culturally, it's fantastic. it does get really busy in terms of this, but it is a fantastic benefit. And we're talking about the BBC. Maybe the BBC should be covering this and the economic benefits that this brings Scotland every single year. It's a fantastic a celebration of what Scotland and Edinburgh is, and I'm looking forward to the show this afternoon and hopefully get another few in before the festival winds up. But it's a fantastic benefit to Scotland.
Okay, so that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everybody who has donated and everybody who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We can only exist with your support. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. So I just want to say thank you for watching, and thank you very much again to our guests, Paul McLennan and Hugh Marshall. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.
Thanks, folks.
Eamon Guerin, lovely to meet you and to see your show, which is entitled
Lawrence of Arabia and Me.
And I have to say I loved it. Having known about and studied Lawrence myself over many years, just from an interest that I developed when I was a teenager, really, possibly brought about because of my affection for Peter O'Toole and the movie. However, that said, I have actually read Seven Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence's huge work, and I'm one of the few, I suspect, in this particular space that has done so. But I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the way that you've woven the story of Lawrence into your reflections and your knowledge of the modern Middle East and how current situations have been arrived at as a result, using almost the medium of Lawrence to help to produce that.
So nice to be here with you to start with, thank you. So I've spent virtually all of my adult working life working on or in the Middle East. I've lived in much of the Middle East and North Africa for 30 years. I'm a recovering journalist. I'm a writer, public historian. I teach at Oxford, and all the time you're aware that you want a bigger audience. Not just for me, but for people to understand the modern Middle East, because every time you turn on the news, it seems like the Middle East is just a mess. And I am tired of people thinking that it's always a mess, that somehow it's the people of the region are to blame for the situation. There are bad actors everywhere. So I had this idea to bring T.E. Lawrence's Ghost back to explain the First World War in the Middle East, which is when Britain made all these contradictory promises, and which is a lot of the foundations for the problems in the Middle East today. And so if you can make something entertaining, the history comes alive, and that's what I've tried to do. On the stage we have the ghost of T.E. Lawrence over here, and on the other side of the stage also me going back and forth as a professor, loosely based on me, who has these interactions where the professor can't see Lawrence, but Lawrence sees him. And then Lawrence and the professor both talk about the film, because of course David Lean's 1962 epic is basically anything that people know about the film. I mean, you've read Seven Pillars of Wisdom, I've read Seven Pillars of Wisdom, but many people haven't. But I just think that there's a lack of understanding about the modern Middle East, and there's room for more empathy for the suffering of the people in the region that I think we can get to through this medium of theatre.
I wondered, one of the things that struck me about when you were talking about Lawrence was, his. You talked about his interest in medievalism. He was a student at Oxford, of course, and his interest in chivalry and a sort of romantic streak, perhaps you could call it. I know, he cycled through the Middle East when he was a student. I think he got a first, for his dissertation on medieval castles. But I just wonder if you think that is one of the things that drove him to embrace, if you like, the cause of Arab independence, because it seems to me that that's certainly something that was probably the case.
Yeah, no, Lawrence was absolutely obsessed as a young man by medieval tales of chivalry, King Arthur, the knights in Knights of the Round Table. In fact, when all of his schoolboy friends were off playing football or rugby or whatever else, he would be on his bicycle cycling to country churches and making brass rubbings of any sort of knight's crusader he could find. And no spoilers, but, Lawrence was born illegitimate, which for us, it's neither here nor there, quite rightly so. But he was born in 1888, so when he discovers around his 13th birthday that he's illegitimate, his mother and father are not married, there was a deep sense of shame, I think, without getting into too much psychobabble. And I think that drove him to look for a chivalric code somewhere beyond his home county, or where he grew up in Oxford anyway. And that's, I think, what drove him to the Middle East. And he saw in these Arabs during the First World War an opportunity to realize, to live out some of those sort of medieval tales, in the flesh. He's an interesting character.
Yeah, and of course, as a result of that activity, or those activities he was involved in, he became enormously famous. Which, as I think you mentioned in the play, at first he found amusing and didn't mind, but then very much rejected it. Although I can't remember who actually described him as this, but as doing this, but they described him as backing into the limelight, and suggesting that, in fact, even though he claimed he was not interested in that sort of fame, he welcomed it in some ways. What are your thoughts on that?
It was an old friend, I can't remember off the top of my head, but who said he had a talent for backing into the limelight. I think Lawrence really loved the idea of being a famous literary figure. He wrote Seven Pillars of Wisdom to be an epic. It's 400,000 words, twice the length of Moby Dick. He loved that idea. He liked translating poetry from Arabic. He translated the Odyssey from Greek. He was a man of letters. What happened after the war was that this slideshow, this picture show that was started by the American showman Lowell Thomas, completely pivoted what he was famous for. So instead of literature, it was as this berobed hero fighting with the Arabs. And that sort of side of the mythology came to dominate everything about Lawrence from 1920, arguably, until the present day. I mean, that's what David Lean serves us up in the movie Lawrence of Arabia in 1962. And I think that became an embarrassment to Lawrence. He really wanted to be known. And if you look at his letters and his friendships before his death in 1935, he was friendly with so many literary figures. He was writing letters. George Bernard Shaw and Mrs. Bernard Shaw were great friends. Thomas Hardy, he wrote to Elgar. All of the great modern literature, modern figures of literature, he liked and courted them.
And just getting back to what you're doing at the moment, you're obviously working with diplomats, talking through elements of the Middle East and sort of current events. I wonder, can you just expand a little bit on what you're doing there?
So for the past 12 years, initially with the US government, the State Department, and now more latterly with the FCDO, or Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, I've developed training courses for British and American diplomats who are going to be posted to the Middle East and North Africa. Virtually every diplomat I've ever met is extremely intelligent and they are driven, but they need to understand what region they're going into. And so I provide a lot of the background, whether it's the history, the politics, the religion, the differences, which are so important between peoples. And then we run these training courses at the Foreign Office, contracted by the Foreign Office, to help them when they go out to the region. So, this Edinburgh Fringe is a completely different audience, but essentially it's the same job, I envisage, of developing understanding, a better understanding for a foreign part of the world.
Yeah. Brilliant. That's lovely. Thank you so much for your time. It's much appreciated, and honestly, I would recommend everyone go to see this show. It is a brilliant insight into not just the modern state of affairs in the Middle East, but also the way that Lawrence's persona, if you like, has played into a perception of it from us in the UK and right across the world. So it was fabulous. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.